Good morning, dear friends. My name is Igor Yakovenko. Today is February 6th in Kiev. It is now 7 o'clock. Just a second, please. The broadcast started unexpectedly. I apologize. Well, then, let's go ahead and continue our conversation together. So, taking a closer look at the current events unfolding today, there is some very significant good news to share. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine officially reported yesterday that their units successfully carried out a strategic series of precision strikes, targeting the critical infrastructure located at the Kapustin Yar missile test range deep within Russian territory. Ballistic missiles are launched from there at Ukrainian territory, in particular, the Oreshnik missiles. Apparently, serious damage was inflicted, and it's quite possible that this will hinder further strikes. According to the General Staff, the strikes were carried out by Ukrainian long-range Laminho missiles. Another piece of good news is that yesterday, for the first time in several months, a prisoner exchange took place under the 157 for 157 formula. Well, that's probably the only good thing that can be said about these negotiations in Abu Dhabi. So I guess that's it. Everything else gives no cause for optimism. Let's try. But once again, I want to highlight this. It's great. 157. It is truly heartening to see that these Ukrainians have finally made it back home, and that is certainly something for us all to be very happy about. Now, as for the actual details of the negotiations themselves, well, there remains a certain thick fog surrounding the situation here, and its specifically concerns. And the main topic of our conversation today is distrust, because of what's happening in the world in general. Right now, there is a general decline in the two main civilizational values on which, in fact, modern civilization stands. I'm referring not only to European civilization, but to civilization in the broadest sense of the word. And these two values are freedom and trust. And so, right now, we're seeing a kind of general temporary decline, a decline in both of these values, a decrease in trust and a decrease in freedom. This is evident. What is happening in the war? The level of freedom in Russia is decreasing. It's absolutely obvious. With several of Trump's actions, the level of freedom is decreasing. In the United States of America, various back and forth movements regarding this value are happening in other countries around the world. But the level of trust is definitely falling. The level of trust at the international level, the level of trust between states, and specifically what is happening at the negotiations. The main reason, of course, for the complete and guaranteed failure of these negotiations is absolute distrust. Distrust, first and foremost, towards Russia as a negotiating partner. So, well, first let's look at the official statements, what the official representative of the president, Kirill Dmitriev, said following these negotiations. So he was very critical of the United Kingdom of Europe, saying that they are constantly trying to disrupt the negotiation process, constantly trying to interfere in it. And then, based on the claim that supposedly someone is trying to interfere in the negotiations, I just don't know what this looked like, that someone from the UK delegation flew to Abu Dhabi, tried to get into that room, so to speak, and take a seat at the negotiating table. Well, it's unlikely that such an event actually happened. But here's what did Mr. Dmitriev say in this case? He simply lied, just as Russian representatives constantly lie. But Mr. Dmitriev didn't stop there. He went on to claim that we see that undoubtedly there is progress, there is good positive movement forward, What does that mean? In other words, how exactly? What does positive movement forward mean? How is it supposed to end? It is supposed to end in peace. Is there any idea how these negotiations are supposed to bring about peace if Dmitriev's boss, Putin, has no intention of ending the war, as Putin himself constantly says? So, in that case, what does Dmitriev say? He simply lied. Once again, congratulations to him for lying. Now, the main state agency TASS reports the following. So, what does that mean? It means that according to the results of the negotiations in Abu Dhabi, all countries, I'm just quoting this TASS text, all countries must recognize Donbas as Russian. Russia sees this as part of a larger agreement. Therefore, I have very carefully read through every one of the detailed reports, and also Russia's official diplomatic position, but nowhere in those documents have I heard it stated that, from the specific point of view of the Russian Federation, all sovereign countries must. This is so absurd that even the Russian delegation is incapable of doing it, of putting forward such a demand. For the condition of signing a peace treaty to be that all countries must recognize Donbas as Russian, such a formulation, it seems to me, not even Medinsky could have come up with it. Because what does all countries even mean? The 19 countries that are members of the United Nations, is that it? Or is it all countries? Which ones? Or is it all the countries of the European Union? Or, well, basically, in short, there just can't be such a formulation. So what did the telegraph agency of the Soviet Union, that is TASS, announce in this case? Well, it simply lied. That's the story, basically. As for the truly fundamental reason why it can't happen, as for these negotiations, the idea that they could end in peace, I can cite a relatively recent poll conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. There are some very important topics there related to how Ukrainians feel about the possibility of signing a peace agreement in the event of concessions, territorial concessions. So, here is a look at what was recently reported. 40% of the total respondents who were surveyed by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology would potentially allow for the strategic withdrawal of troops from the Donbas region, specifically in exchange for finally ending the ongoing war. 52% are against it. That's quite a significant gap, but nevertheless, we see that a fairly large number of Ukrainian citizens believe that even such terms could be accepted. But at the same time, 65% of those surveyed said they are ready to endure the war for as long as it takes. And perhaps the primary and most deeply rooted feeling that Ukrainians are collectively experiencing today is a deep-seated and overwhelming distrust of Russia. According to the latest survey results, it shows that over 70% of Ukrainians firmly believe that Russia either wants to carry out a full-scale physical genocide of the Ukrainian people or completely destroy the entire Ukrainian nation as a whole. So this really is an existential war. It is abundantly clear that the Ukrainian people understand perfectly well that the Russians have absolutely no intention of stopping their advance at the Donbas region, and they dream not only of capturing Kyiv, but of seizing the entirety of all of Ukraine. This fundamental and justified distrust is the reason why, of course, no negotiations will lead to peace. And one more thing. I'd like to talk about some events which, frankly speaking, if it weren't for today, well, more often than not, it is the regularly scheduled nightly press review. And I think it is fair to say that this particular event, which, as I mentioned before, Well, all the front pages of every newspaper, every TV channel, everything would have been buzzing, boiling over, but now I haven't really seen that. So I analyzed it. So late at night, I usually check everything. Well, when I'm carefully preparing for our upcoming conversation, I make sure to look at about 2 dozen different news sources and reports to be fully ready. Roughly speaking, that's how it is. These are American sources, European ones, Deutsche Welle, BBC, of course, the usual ones, so to speak, Russian opposition sources like Radio Liberty and so on. The Moscow Times blogs, I look through them. And, I didn't find any information about an event that would have once been front page news, completely by accident. I stumbled upon the fact that, as it turns out, attention, today the 25th Winter Olympics opens. Well, let's remember, back in the day, the Olympics, now that was an event, everyone would be talking about it and nothing else. Now, not a peep. I checked the Russian TV schedules. They're not planning to cover it. And in general, the Western press isn't really paying much attention either. So today it opens the 25th Winter Olympics. It will be opened in Italy. The reason why Russian media aren't paying attention to these Olympics is that at this Olympics, first of all, it's forbidden for the Russian and Belarusian teams to participate as teams. That is, the flag, anthem, and so on are banned. So 13 Russian athletes have been allowed to participate privately as individuals. This is a repeat of what happened in 1908, back when the Olympics were just getting started, and generally no one really understood what it was, and as they say, sports in Russia at that time, let's just say, weren't really in fashion yet. So 1908, and now again, 13 people. And of course, they will be competing under a neutral flag. But in general, it must be said that understanding why in this situation, Russia is not interested. The Russian government and state television are not interested in covering the Olympics is more or less clear. But I'm not really sure, I haven't watched. European or American sports outlets, but generally in such major international global media, they aren't really making a big deal out of it either. So, what's the reason? Again, the reason by and large is some pretty serious problems with trust. So what does that mean? First of all, it's the constant doping scandals, endless disqualifications. In other words, people don't really trust what they see on the screen. So when you see some sporting events on the screen, there's always the question, is this person really that talented on their own, or are they, so to speak, under the influence of some serious doping? That's why they achieve such feats. This is exactly what has been taking place over the course of the last few years. For example, if you take a look back at the 2014 Winter Olympic Games held in Sochi, those were incredibly grand and pompous Olympic Games in which Russia emerged as the triumphant winner, showcasing immense national pride and significant athletic achievement on the world stage. But then, it suddenly turned out that the primary reason for this massive triumph was actually the remarkable and secretive work of the FSB employees, who would carefully pass the urine sample bottles through a small hole in the wall and then swap them out for clean ones. So in short, all the successes of the Russian Olympic team, or almost all of them, were based on doping, on stimulants. And in order for this not to be noticed, Russia, with the help of the FSB, carried out this remarkable special operation of swapping out those urine sample bottles. I can just imagine an FSB officer with a special assignment namely to swap out urine samples. Well, that's fine. Work is work, just like any other job. That's the kind of guys they are. So basically, this 2014 Sochi doping scandal is what sowed massive distrust toward Russia. Besides what happened next, well, 2014, we all know perfectly well what that means, the occupation of Crimea. And this is the echo of that scandal. And on top of that, of course, what's happening now, the war has, in my opinion, overshadowed the very essence of sports. So, in addition to all that, this historic 25th Olympic Games also strongly resonates with the prevailing public sentiments and opinions regarding Donald Trump. Because, as it turned out, specialized units from the American Immigration Police, specifically these ICE agents, are now traveling to the Olympics in order to provide a significant layer of extra security for the event. There are already protests against them in Italy because people here are protesting, saying they're not welcome, that this is a police force that kills. In Milan and other Italian cities, rallies have already taken place with slogans like, "We are not waiting for Nazi stormtroopers." These are protests against ICE. Once again, at the very heart of this entire issue is distrust. We don't know what kind of personnel have arrived. Are they the ones who killed, the ones who took part in crackdowns? Were they involved in the protests in the United States, or are they completely different, decent people? But the general distrust of Trump, distrust of what's happening in America, is spilling over here as well. And ultimately, I don't know to what extent, as this Olympics goes on, there will still be competition, not just scandals. To exactly what degree will the purely sporting aspect of this massive event be able to overshadow all of the accompanying factors and controversies? And overall, I have the feeling that this Olympics will be remembered like this. There was a major war going on in Europe. Trump was trying to force his way through. The United States of America, in Iran, there was a brutal suppression of protests. And by the way, something else was happening too. It seems there was also a Winter Olympics in Milan. I have the feeling that against the backdrop of this shrinking freedom in the world and the catastrophic decline in trust, sport, as a phenomenon that is undoubtedly based on freedom and trust, is also beginning to gradually shrink. And so, once again, please let me try right now to carefully check this one more time. Well, the main thing is still the news agency, the Russian one, REA Novosti. That's what it's called. And now I'll try to look at the REA Novosti page. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So looking at this closely, what exactly do we see over there? Yes, in the sports section, there are some completely... So, I'm reading now. Ovechkin's assist helped Washington surpass Nashville. The Saudi League made a statement after Ronaldo's boycott. The Russian flag was displayed in the stands during the match between the Americans and the Czechs. Minsk's Dynamo defeated Lada, ending their streak. Basically, in short, anything but the Olympics. Avangard was eliminated after losing to Automobilist. So in short, no, there are no Olympics, you see. There are no Olympics at all. Maybe it really doesn't exist, I don't know. So in short, that's the kind of amazing story with... We're not the only ones talking about a crisis. We talk about a crisis in the UN, a crisis in NATO, a crisis in diplomacy. All of this apparently is a manifestation of the total crisis of the attributes of modern civilization. And that includes such a phenomenon as the Olympic movement. It has somehow shriveled, faded, and is gradually coming to an end.